So the idea is that the Sphinx was there long before the pyramids, and the pyramids were built by the Egyptian to celebrate further an already holy place.
Yeah, and there were platforms in place where the pyramids stand. Not the pyramids as we see them today, but the base of those pyramids was already in place at that time.
So what's the case? What's the evidence that the Egyptologists use to make the attributions that they do for the dating of the pyramids and the Sphinx?
Well, the three great pyramids of Giza are different from later pyramids. This is another problem that I have with the whole thing. Is the story of pyramid building? When did it really begin? And the timeline that we get from Egyptology is the first pyramid is the pyramid of the pharaoh Zoser, the step pyramid at Saqqara, about 100 years or so before the Giza pyramids are built. And then we have this explosion in the fourth dynasty of true pyramids. We have three of them attributed to a single pharaoh, Sneferu, who built, supposedly, the pyramid at Maidum and the two pyramids at Dashur, the bent and the red pyramid. And then within that same 100-year span, we have the Giza pyramids being built. This is according to the Orthodox chronology. And then suddenly, once the Giza project is finished, pyramid building goes into a massive slump in ancient Egypt. And the pyramids of the fifth dynasty are, frankly speaking, a mess outside. They're very inferior constructions. You can hardly recognize them as pyramids at all. But what happens when you go inside them is you find that they're extensively covered in hieroglyphs and imagery, repeating the name of the king who was supposedly buried in that place. Whereas the Giza pyramids have no internal inscriptions whatsoever. What we do have is one piece of graffiti about which there is some controversy. Basic statistics, it's a 6 million ton structure. Each side is about 750 feet long.
Yeah.
It's aligned almost perfectly to true north, south, east, and west, within 3/60ths of a single degree. 60ths because degrees are divided into 60s. It's the precision of the orientation and the absolute massive size of the thing, plus its very complicated internal passageways that are involved in it. You know, in the 9th century, the Great Pyramid still had its facing stones in place, but there was an Arab Caliph al-Mamun, who had already realized that other pyramids did have their entrances in the north face. Nobody knew where the entrance to the Great Pyramid was. But he figured, if there's an entrance to this thing, it's going to be in the north face somewhere. So he put together a team of workers, and they went in with sledgehammers, and they started smashing where he thought would be the entrance. And they cut their way into the Great Pyramid for a distance of maybe 100 feet. And then the hammering that they did dislodged something. They heard a little bit further away something big falling, and they realized there was a cavity there, and they started heading in that direction. And then they joined the internal passageway of the Great Pyramid, the descending and the ascending corridors that go up. When you go up the ascending corridor, every one of the internal passageways in the Great Pyramid that people can walk in slopes at an angle of 26 degrees. That's interesting because the angle of slope of the exterior of the Great Pyramid is 52 degrees. So we know mathematicians were at work as well as geometers in the creation of the Great Pyramid. If you go up the Grand Gallery, which is at the end of the so-called ascending corridor, and it's above the so-called Queen's Chamber. You go up the Grand Gallery, you're eventually going to come to what is known as the King's Chamber, in which there is a sarcophagus. And that sarcophagus is a little bit too big to have been got in through the narrow entrance passageway. It's almost as though the so-called King's Chamber was built around the sarcophagus already in place. Above the king's chamber are 5 other chambers. These are known as relieving chambers. The theory was that they were built to relieve the pressure on the king's chamber of the weight of the monument. But I think what makes that theory dubious is the fact that even lower down, where more weight was involved, you have the queen's chamber, and there are no such relieving chambers above that. In the top of these 5 chambers, a British adventurer and vandal called Howard Vyse, who dynamited his way into those chambers in the first place, allegedly found, well, he claims he found the graffiti, a piece of graffiti left by a work gang naming the pharaoh Khufu. And it's true, I've been in that chamber, and there is the cartouche of Khufu there, quite recognizable. But the dispute around it is whether that is a genuine piece of graffiti dating from the Old Kingdom, or whether Howard Vyse actually put it there himself because he was in desperate need of money at the time. I'm not sure what the answer to that question is. Another reason why, but it's one of the reasons that Egyptologists feel confident in saying that the pyramid is the work of Khufu. Another is what is called the Wadi al-Jarf papyri, where on the Red Sea, a diary, the diary of an individual called Merer, was found, and he talks about bringing highly polished limestone to the Great Pyramid. And it's clear that what he's talking about is the facing stones of the Great Pyramid. He's not talking about the body of the Great Pyramid. He's talking about the facing stones of the Great Pyramid during the reign of Khufu. So that's another reason why the Great Pyramid is attributed to Khufu. But I think that Khufu was undoubtedly involved in the Great Pyramid, and in a big way. But I think he was building upon and elaborating a much older structure. And I think the heart of that structure is the subterranean chamber, which is 100 feet vertically beneath the base of the Great Pyramid. Anybody who suffers from claustrophobia will not enjoy being down there. You got to go down a 26-degree sloping corridor until a distance of about 300 feet. It's 100 feet vertically, but the slope means you're going to walk a distance of about, not walk, you're going to ape walk. You're almost going to have to crawl. I've learned from long experience that the best way to go down these corridors is actually backwards. If you go forward, you keep bumping your head on them because they're only 3 feet 5 inches high. You get down to the bottom, you have a short horizontal passage, and then you get into the subterranean chamber. The theory of Egyptology is that this was supposed to be the burial place of Khufu. But after cutting out that 300-foot-long, 26-degree sloping passage, a lot of which passes through bedrock, and having cut the subterranean chamber out of bedrock, gone to all that trouble, they decided they wouldn't bury him there, and they built what's now known as the Queen's Chamber as his burial chamber. But then they decided that wouldn't do either, so they then built the King's Chamber, and that's where the pharaoh is supposed to have been buried. Those Arab raiders under Caliph Mamun didn't find anything in the Great Pyramid at all.
So your idea is that the Sphinx and maybe some aspects of the pyramid were much earlier,
Yes.
and why that's important is, in that case, it would be evidence of some transfer of technology.
Yes.
From a much older civilization.
Yeah.
The idea is that during the Younger Dryas, most of that civilization was either destroyed or damaged, and they desperately scattered across the globe,
Seeking refuge.
and telling stories of maybe the importance of the stars,
Mm-hmm.
their knowledge about the stars,
Yeah.
and their knowledge about building and knowledge about navigation.
Mm-hmm. That's roughly the idea. So it's interesting that the ancient Egyptians have a notion of an epoch that they call Zeptepi, which is the first time. It means the first time. This is when the gods walked the earth. This is when 7 sages brought wisdom to ancient Egypt. And that is seen as the origin of ancient Egyptian civilization. There are king lists by the ancient Egyptians themselves. There are king lists that go back way beyond the first dynasty, go back 30,000 years into the past in ancient Egypt, considered to be entirely mythical by Egyptologists. But nevertheless, it's interesting that there's that reference to remote time. Now, what you also have in Egypt are what might almost be described as secret societies. The followers of Horus are one of those, specifically tasked with bringing forward the knowledge from the first time into later periods. The souls of Pe and Neken are another one of these mysterious secret society groups who are possessors of knowledge that they transmit to the future. And what I'm broadly suggesting is that those survivors of the Younger Dryas cataclysm who settled in Giza may have been relatively small in number. It's interesting that they are referred to in the Edfu building text as 7 sages, because that repeats again and again. It's also in Mesopotamia. It's 7 sages, 7 Apkallu, who come out of the waters of the Persian Gulf and teach people all the skills of agriculture and of architecture and of astronomy. It's found all around the world that there was a relatively small number of people who took refuge in Giza, who benefited from the survival skills of the hunter-foragers who lived at Giza at that time, and who also passed on their knowledge to those hunter-foragers. But it was not knowledge that was ready to be put into shape at that time. And that knowledge was then preserved and kept and handled within very secretive groups that passed it down over thousands of years. And finally, it bursts into full form in the 4th dynasty in ancient Egypt. And you know, the notion that knowledge might be transferred over thousands of years shouldn't be absurd. We know, for example, in the case of ancient Israel, it goes back to the time of Abraham, which is pretty much, I think, around 2000 BC, and knowledge has been preserved from that time right up to the present day. So if you can preserve knowledge for 4,000 years, you can probably preserve it for 8.